about some specific things that I learned throughout my 15 or so years in hospice and palliative care that I think are really important in terms of the planning and being prepared for end of life and a good death experience. Hi, my name is Abigail. I'm here to normalize these conversations and education about death and dying so we die better at end of life. Let's get into it today. Throughout my 15 or so years in hospice and palliative care, I started to, just because of the number of years that I worked there, I started to really see trends in certain things. And what I ended up seeing over and over again just throughout those years was just how certain things pop up at end of life that most people just are not prepared for. And this is a big list of things. Obviously there's just so much to talk about. That's why we do this thing. But what I walked away with in terms of overall things to try to kind of make things as easy as possible, and when I was talking to new staff coming in and updating things like our electronic medical record and tools for our staff to teach them, I basically boiled it down to 4 things that every dying person does at end of life that will help us kind of zoom in a little bit more, focus in on how we can develop our plan of care, because it was from a lot of lessons learned and from situations that I just remember talking about repeatedly at our interdisciplinary team meetings. So we're going to talk about those things today. Now, these 4 things that I'm going to list off have no particular order. So it doesn't mean just because I list the first one first, it means that happens first. It doesn't. These things can happen in all sorts of different types of orders, but just something that I usually just kind of start with is usually like the physical stuff. So we'll get into that. And the first thing that I want to talk about is that every person does when they're dying is they stop being able to swallow. Now, this impacts a few things, right? It impacts somebody's ability to eat and drink, and it impacts, even more importantly, I believe, their ability to take their routine medications, their pills that they have been on. They could have been on for months before this event where they're getting close to dying, or they could have been on it for years. So this is what's really important. Now, when we talk about food and fluid intake at end of life, this is always something that is a very sensitive topic for many people because food is often equated with love. And when someone no longer can eat, a lot of people jump to, oh my gosh, I need to make sure that my loved one is getting food somehow. So we got to put it in a feeding tube. We got to do all this. The one thing I want to remind you of is when a dying body is dying, it's going through these natural processes of becoming more unconscious, becoming weaker, no longer being able to do things like eat and take care of themselves, things like that we're talking about here. This is a part of normal death and dying. You don't do a normal death and dying process by running a marathon and eating a salami sandwich. No. So no longer being able to eat and drink is a natural part of the dying process. What happens when someone is no longer able eating and drinking and they're in this dying process, they actually start to release certain other hormones and they shift in terms of the types of energy they burn and things like that. So they actually become and get into more of a euphoric state because they have things like ketones elevated in the blood. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the ketogenic diet and ketones and things like that, you can kind of understand what happens there. So the urge to eat is actually minimized. And you know how when you're really, really sick, you don't really feel like eating? I don't know if that's really happened to me. It happened to me a couple times, yes, but for the most part, I'm always willing and able to eat anything that I want because I really enjoy my food. But for the most part, when you are really ill, your appetite does go down. So there's a reason for all of that because your blood flow is really being prioritized to certain other organs like your lungs, like your brain, things like that, and not so much prioritized to your digestive system. So it is normal. It is a very healthy part of the process to not want to desire food at this point. Now, when we see someone that's dying, usually I am pretty specific and extra thoughtful about fluid comfort. Now, not giving fluids, not trying to shove fluids down their mouth or putting an IV or things like that, but mostly with their oral care, because mostly people who are dying, they will die with their mouth open. So I'm bringing that up because this is something that we can incorporate in terms of our plan of care to ensure that we're doing regular, frequent oral care, keeping that mouth, that oral mucosa nice and moist to keep that person comfortable. So that's really important. The other thing I want to address here are the medications. I did 2 pretty lengthy videos on this because it does require quite a bit of discussion and overview. So I'm going to link those down here, because when it comes to the point that a person can no longer take their regularly scheduled oral medications because they're in a natural dying process and they're no longer able to swallow, there are certain things that we can do. We don't need to at all continue or try to figure out how we continue all the oral medications that they've been on, but there are certain medications that we really need to look at and really study and see how can we maintain therapeutic levels of those types of medications and those types of the effects of those medications in the blood to keep that person comfortable in the dying process. That's all I'm going to say about that, because these 2 videos go into depth on that. So please look at those 2 videos, and they will definitely go over that. So we covered the first thing that always happens to the person who is dying. They no longer are able to swallow. That impacts their fluid and oral intake, and that will eventually also impact their routine medications that they take. Second thing that always happens to a person that is dying is that they no longer are able to do things like take care for themselves. So they aren't able to do the typical activities of daily living that are essential for our daily living. Things like being able to feed themselves, prepare their meals, get dressed, use the toilet, things like that, bathe, things like that. So what does that mean? It means that we need to have a plan in place to ensure that when this person is no longer able to take care of themselves, we have something in place, some caregiving. We divide the shifts up amongst the caregivers, the loved ones, whatever it is, or they maybe are placed into another facility that can provide this type of care. So, and you're not a bad person if you do that. I know that there's a lot of feeling behind that in terms of placing somebody. There's financial, responsibilities, things like that. We're not going to address that here right now, but what I do want to say is that we need to think of a plan. Now, you may always think that, oh, we're so far away from that. No. For many people who are seriously ill and or elderly, something simple as just a fall that doesn't even look that serious can really dislocate their hip. Maybe they can fracture a bone in their leg, like their femur, or even if they just tap their head on the ground gently, can cause a serious bleed in their brain. And all of a sudden you have this person who is independent become completely dependent on help with all of their daily living tasks. And then you're really just stuck with, okay, what do we do? So who is going to take care of this person? Can you bring this person home on hospice, for example? Yes. Can you and the family members, other loved ones, divide and conquer all the different activities that they need during the day to ensure that they're bathed and they're clean, to ensure that if they are continuing to have oral intake, that someone is in charge of that, giving them their medications, all those types of things, dressing them, making sure they can use a toilet, bathing them, all that kind of stuff. How are we going to ensure that's going to happen? And if you need to go to a nursing facility or a certain other facility, a nursing home or assisted living, there are many types of different, there are certain types of different facilities that we need to look at. There are, financial, there's a financial burden that does come with those, especially if you're putting somebody on hospice. And, there's a lot to uncover there, but, it is something that we need to start talking about now, because it is extremely important that we don't just wait until the last minute, because it's always inevitably when you're not ready that these things like this happen. And we need to make decisions really quickly. So we talked about no longer being able to swallow, then no longer being able to take care of themselves. What's the third thing that happens to every person that's dying? Again, these are not in order. These are things that happen to every person that's dying. The third thing that I want to discuss is the person is no longer able to make medical decisions on their own behalf. I also made another video on this where I talk about, having certain medications, documents completed, and really ensuring that you ideally have an attorney review those, you have them signed, notarize, all those kinds of things, and distributed to the parties that are responsible for making decisions, talking to your provider, talking to those people that will be making decisions, even though you have them down on paper, and also writing it down, being really, really clear as to what you really desire at end of life in terms of your medical decision making. You do not want to be left in a situation where if it's you that is no longer able to make decisions on your behalf, that you have family members fighting over what's the best thing for you, especially if you have different, types of theories and thought processes in terms of how your end of life should be handled, or different philosophies, different religious things like that, or if it's a loved one, you don't want to be stuck with, oh my gosh, I have to make decisions for this person, but I don't know what they would want in this situation. So this is why we talk about this. Okay, last thing that happens to every person that is dying, there will be some degree usually of end of life symptom that pops up. Usually that is related to their medical diagnoses or conditions. And or there are also just other things that pop up that you just don't always expect. So this is why, again, you need to have hospice involved, because they can help anticipate the care that will be needed based on the medical diagnoses, the conditions, the illnesses that that person who is dying has. So say like the person has some kind of kidney issue, they have a lung issue or a heart issue or brain issue, whatever it is, they can help anticipate the things that can pop up at end of life and help plan for those things accordingly, whether it's having certain medications ready at the bedside to having other types of interventions in place, ready, taught to the caregiver, so that when that thing does happen, we just do a seamless transition and change what our interventions are and put the interventions in place. And so that we really ensure that that person who develops that end-of-life symptom, they remain comfortable throughout their dying process. So these things are really imperative. So again, every dying person will do all these 4 things at some point in the dying and declining process. They'll no longer be able to swallow. Again, this impacts food and fluid intake and medications. They'll no longer be able to do self-care. They won't be able to take care of themselves. So this will impact the plan for how do we ensure that this person gets the care that they need to remain safe and comfortable. They will no longer be able to make medical decisions on their own behalf. So we need to make sure that we have the right paperwork in place, the right people identified, and all of those things in place so that we can make sure medical decisions are made based on their wishes and desires. And lastly, they will develop most likely an end-of-life symptom related usually to their type of physical diagnoses and medical conditions, and just end-of-life stuff in general that always pops up at end of life. So having hospice involved, being prepared for all those types of symptoms and anticipating them, having a plan in place, will really help ensure that death is as comfortable as possible. Having all these things, being aware of them, planning for them accordingly, it's just so critical. So I'll leave it at that. Again, I'll link the other videos here in the caption. Let me know if you have questions, of course. Let me know if you need me to expand on anything else, or if you can't find a video, whatever it is, let me know how I can help you. We'll talk soon. I'm Abigail, normalizing conversations and education about death and dying so we die better at the end of life. I'll talk to you soon.